The Mafia boss ruled with silence until silence turned against him. His daughter wouldn't speak, wouldn't look, until the dog arrived. For nearly a year, Riccardo Bruno ruled his world without mercy, but couldn't unlock the silence of his only child. No eye contact. No laughter. No sound. Just endless stillness in a house lined with gold and guarded by men with guns. And then one day, a cream-colored dog stepped through the doors of Casa Bruno. That was when everything changed. Sesto Bruno, 2 years old, sat on the imported rug of their Westchester estate, her tiny fingers clutching a red scrap of silk. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just watched silently as the dog padded toward her. Riccardo stood frozen near the fireplace, his hands slightly raised like a man preparing for gunfire. He had stared down men with knives, walked through fire for his empire. But now he could only whisper, "Alessia, she's looking at him." Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Riccardo Bruno sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his reflection glinting in the polished surface like a ghost. Around him, his lieutenants filled the room with smoke, murmurs, and nervous glances. The conversation had started with territory, always territory, and drifted to whispers about the Vitali family making new moves downtown. Someone had mentioned a shipment, someone else a betrayal, and still, Riccardo's mind was far away. He could hear the voices, but not the words. All he saw was the image of Sesto sitting on the carpet that morning, staring into the eyes of that cream-colored dog like he'd been sent by God himself. Luca Moretti, his consigliere, watched him from across the table, his sharp eyes reading every subtle tell, the distracted fingers tapping on glass, the delayed nods. "Rick," Luca said quietly, "you with us?" The men stopped talking, their attention snapping toward the boss. Riccardo blinked slowly, his gaze steady but distant. "Go on," he muttered, waving a hand. "Vitali's men won't move without a reason. Let them sweat." The underboss, Marzio, cleared his throat, adjusting his tie like a man about to confess a sin. "We can't afford to let them expand near the docks," he said, voice brittle. "They're testing us. Testing you." Riccardo leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had killed men for less than the tone Marzio used, but tonight, he felt nothing. There was no spark of anger, no urge to remind them who he was. His mind kept drifting to that stare, those dark, unwavering eyes of his daughter, and how, for the first time in months, she'd looked alive. "Boss?" Luca's tone sharpened. "You want to weigh in?" Riccardo's jaw flexed once, and then he rose from his seat. The room quieted immediately, chairs creaking, cigarettes forgotten. "Handle it," he said. "I trust your judgment." He walked out before anyone could answer, the echo of his shoes stretching down the marble hallway like gunfire in an empty church. Outside the meeting room, Riccardo leaned against the wall and exhaled through his nose, his pulse steady but heavy. He should have cared about the business, about control, about dominance, but for the first time in years, the empire felt irrelevant. Every conversation sounded hollow against the memory of his child's silence. The thought haunted him, what if she never speaks? What if she never hears me? He rubbed a hand over his face, the calluses scraping against his stubble. Even power, it seemed, could not protect him from a house that had gone quiet. Luca joined him a moment later, shutting the door softly behind him. "You're somewhere else, Rick," he said, voice calm but firm. "And not the good kind of somewhere else." Riccardo didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the chandelier above the foyer. "It's not the business," Luca continued. "You've survived wars, betrayals, FBI raids, but this is eating you alive." The boss stayed silent, but Luca pressed on. "Even wolves retreat to heal their young. Maybe it's time you did too." Riccardo turned his head slowly, studying the man who had stood beside him for over 20 years. Luca wasn't wrong. He never was. But stepping away wasn't something Riccardo Bruno did. To disappear, even for a moment, meant weakness, and weakness was an open invitation in this world. Yet when he thought of Sesto's face, pale in the soft morning light, her eyes locked on that dog, He felt something twist inside him that had nothing to do with fear. "Do you ever think," Riccardo asked suddenly, "that some things can't be fixed with control?" Luca tilted his head, half smiling. "Everything breaks differently. Some things need force. Others need time." Riccardo let out a low chuckle, though it carried no joy. "Time," he repeated. "That's the one thing I never learned to buy." Luca placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe it's time to start learning." That night, the mansion was silent except for the faint hum of the city beyond the gates. Riccardo poured himself a drink and stood by the tall window overlooking the grounds. The cream-colored dog Sabbia, Alessia had named him, was asleep by the back doors. Sesto's red cloth lay discarded beside him, as if she trusted him enough to forget it. The sight was both beautiful and unnerving. For the first time in his life, Riccardo Bruno didn't know if he was watching a miracle or a warning. He finished his drink and walked upstairs, his footsteps soft on the carpet. Alessia was already asleep, the faint glow of the bedside lamp brushing against her hair. He sat at the edge of the bed and stared at her for a long moment, at the woman who had once loved a soldier and now lived with a ghost. She looked at him, he whispered into the dim light. Alessia stirred but didn't wake. For the first time, she looked at something. Hours passed, but Riccardo couldn't sleep. The more he tried to push away the thought, the stronger it came. That stare, those eyes, there had been something awake in them. Something Sesto hadn't shown since she'd stopped responding months ago. He reached for his phone, scrolling aimlessly, the blue glow casting shadows across his face. Autism, he read. Speech delay. Childhood trauma. None of it felt right. His daughter wasn't afraid, she was absent. He kept scrolling, articles blurring past until one headline made him stop. When animals heal what words cannot. It was an old blog post, half buried in the feed. A mother described how her son, mute for years, had spoken his first word to a therapy dog. Riccardo read it twice, then again, his mind racing. It wasn't superstition or instinct, it was something deeper. Sound, frequency, connection. Something primal that reached where medicine failed. He leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. A dog, he muttered. Of all things. He scrolled further, companion animals, therapeutic interaction, sensory resonance. It was science, not magic. And yet, to Riccardo, it felt like both. He glanced toward the crib in the adjoining room, where Sesto lay asleep, the faintest sound of her breathing drifting through the open door. In that moment, Riccardo Bruno, the man who had built an empire on fear, loyalty, and silence, realized that none of it mattered if he couldn't reach his own blood. His empire could crumble tomorrow, and he wouldn't care, not if she stayed locked behind that invisible wall. "You'll hear me one day, Piccolina," he whispered. "Even if I have to tear the world apart for it." He rose quietly, crossing into her room. Moonlight painted soft lines across her face, highlighting her small, perfect features. The cream-colored dog lay by the door, head resting on his paws, ever watchful. Riccardo knelt beside Sesto's crib, brushing a hand through her hair. "You saw him," he murmured, his throat tight. "You saw him when you saw no one else." Sesto stirred slightly, one tiny hand twitching in her sleep. It was enough to still him completely. In her faint movements, he saw a spark of life returning. The man who once commanded armies of killers now felt powerless beside a child who hadn't spoken a single word. And for the first time since she was born, Riccardo prayed, not for safety, not for strength, but for sound. Back in his study, he wrote Valerio's name on a notepad, the man he'd once trusted for interrogation dogs in Milan. If anyone could find an animal with presence and patience, it was him. Not a guard dog, Riccardo wrote beneath it. Something calm. Something alive. He folded the note, sliding it into his suit pocket. Tomorrow, he would call. As dawn crept through the heavy curtains, Riccardo sat alone, elbows on the desk, staring into the light. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about rivals or money or the weight of his reputation. He was thinking about connection, something pure, something no business could buy. And in that fragile sliver of morning, the ruthless Don of Westchester allowed himself a single, dangerous thought. Maybe the empire he needed to rebuild wasn't the one outside his gates, but the one inside his home. The call went out just after sunrise. Riccardo leaned against the edge of his desk, one hand clutching a black rotary phone that only 5 people in the world still knew how to reach. He hadn't spoken to Valerio in over a decade, not since Milan, not since the old days when silence was a weapon and dogs were trained to break men long before bullets did. But Valerio still answered like no time had passed, his gravel voice soaked in static and old regret. "Bruno," he said, "if you're calling me, it's not about business. Is it?" "No," Riccardo replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's about something else. Something I can't fix." On the other end, Valerio said nothing for a long moment. "Then, is this about your little girl?" Riccardo closed his eyes. Even thousands of miles away, the word girl felt heavier than lead. "She doesn't speak. Doesn't react. I need something different. Something I can't explain to a doctor." Valerio didn't ask more. He never did. "Give me 48 hours, he said simply. "No promises. But I've got a candidate. Male. For years old. Smart. Gentle. Doesn't bark, hasn't made a sound since the shelter." Riccardo's brow furrowed. "A dog that doesn't bark?" Valerio chuckled softly. "He doesn't need to. That's why he's special." By the time the gates of Casa Bruno opened that Friday afternoon, a black SUV had pulled in, and with it, the kind of stillness Riccardo hadn't felt in years. Valerio stepped out first, older, grayer, wearing the same battered coat from his field days. Behind him, on a short leash, walked a cream-colored retriever mix with a wide chest, calm eyes, and movements like slow water. Riccardo expected nervous panting or tail-wagging chaos. Instead, the dog simply paused at the edge of the gravel path, sat, and looked directly at him. They stood like that for a long moment, man and dog, both unmoving. Riccardo crossed the yard slowly, his steps deliberate. "This him?" he asked. "This is Sabbia," Valerio said, patting the dog's shoulder. "Like sand. Quiet. Shifting. Strong." Sabbia didn't flinch. He didn't sniff or pace or whimper. He just watched. "He's not trained for protection," Valerio warned. "He's trained to feel. To listen. He picks up things people miss." Riccardo nodded, his eyes narrowing. "That's what I need." Valerio handed over the leash without hesitation, but there was something reverent in the gesture, like passing off a weapon forged for peace. "Don't give him commands," he said. "Just let him be. He'll find the child. If there's something to find." Inside, the marble floors absorbed the sound of their steps as Riccardo led Sabbia through the grand hall. He passed portraits of patriarchs, antiques stolen or bartered from centuries of Italian legacy, but none of it mattered. The house had never felt so large or so quiet. Sabbia walked with calm assurance, pausing at corners, sniffing lightly, never pulling. At the base of the stairs, Alessia appeared, arms crossed, lips tight. "You brought home a dog," she said sharply, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "Not a specialist? Not a new test?" "A dog." Riccardo didn't flinch. "If bullets can't solve this," he said coldly, "maybe a bark can." Alessia stepped back, stunned not by the dog, but by the desperation behind his voice. She looked at him differently then, not like a husband, not like a criminal, but like a man running out of answers. Sesto was in the sunroom. The windows stretched to the floor, letting golden light spill across the thick carpet. She sat in the center, red silk clutched in her tiny hands, eyes half-lidded as if caught in a dream. Sabbia stopped at the threshold. He didn't approach. He didn't move. He just sat again, his head tilting slightly, ears perked, waiting. Riccardo held his breath. Alessia's fingers gripped the frame of the doorway. "Do something," she whispered. But Sabbia didn't move. Minutes passed. And then, something changed. Sesto's head turned. Not randomly. Not reflexively. Slowly, deliberately, her eyes locked onto the dog across the room. Her fingers loosened slightly on the cloth. Riccardo's heart pounded like a war drum. Alessia gasped. "She's looking at him." The dog tilted his head the other way. Sesto mirrored it. The same movement. perfectly synchronized. Like two dancers who had never met but somehow knew the same rhythm. Sabbia didn't bark. He didn't growl. But something unspoken passed between them. Riccardo wanted to step forward, to fall on his knees and cry out, but he stayed where he was. It felt sacred. The connection wasn't his. It wasn't even Alessia's. It belonged to the girl and the dog. For the first time in months, their daughter wasn't a mystery. She was awake. Later, in the stillness of the evening, Riccardo sat beside Valerio on the stone terrace. Inside, Sabbia lay beside Sesto's crib, her red cloth folded neatly beside them. "She's not cured," Riccardo said softly. "Not yet." Valerio sipped his espresso. "Doesn't matter," she responded. "That's more than science. That's instinct." Riccardo didn't argue. For once, he had no need to win the conversation. Valerio stood to leave, the last traces of sun catching the silver in his beard. "You're not the man I knew in Milan," he said. That Riccardo would have sent her away. Or himself. Or both. Riccardo met his eyes, voice firm but weary. That Riccardo didn't know what silence could take from you. As the gates closed behind Valerio's car, Riccardo turned back toward the house. The silence was still there, but different. It no longer felt like a void. It felt like a pause before something beautiful. Sabbia had not barked. He hadn't needed to. In a house ruled by shadows, one quiet animal had lit a path through the dark. Have you ever witnessed a moment so quiet, so unexpected, that it changed how you saw someone forever? Leave your answer in the comments and let us know if you've ever experienced a silent miracle of your own. The front door creaked shut behind them, and Sabbia took his first quiet step into the heart of the Bruno estate. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long golden streaks across the floor like sacred threads. In the center of the living room sat Sesto, tiny, still, and swaddled in silence. Her red silk cloth clung to her fingers, crumpled between her palms like a lifeline. Riccardo didn't speak, didn't move. He merely watched from the threshold, as if even the weight of his breath might break something fragile. Sabbia stopped near the edge of the carpet, his paws silent against the floor. He didn't bark, didn't sniff, didn't move closer. He simply sat. His eyes were level with Sesto's, steady and unblinking. For a moment, nothing happened, but Riccardo's chest tightened like a vice, sensing the tension in the room shift from cold detachment to something electric. Then Sesto's head turned, not in a dazed wander, not the listless drifting they'd grown used to, but with intention. It was subtle, but precise. Her gaze moved slowly, as though her body had just remembered it could follow a sound or a presence. And then she found him. Her eyes, dark and wide, locked onto the cream-colored dog like he was the center of a universe only she could see. Alessia gasped behind him, her voice just a whisper. "She's staring at him." Riccardo didn't dare look away. He wasn't sure he even could. His entire body had gone still, like a predator in the woods realizing the prey had come willingly. But this wasn't prey. This was his daughter, not turning away, not retreating, not lost. The silence stretched, impossibly long, thick with questions neither parent could voice. Sesto's fingers twitched, tightening and then loosening their grip on the red cloth. A breath hitched in her throat. She didn't blink. Her gaze didn't waver. 5 minutes passed, and still, the moment held. Then, as softly as a leaf drifting to earth, her hand opened completely. The cloth fell to her lap. It landed without ceremony, but the impact reverberated through Riccardo's bones like an explosion. Alessia stifled a sob, one hand pressed to her mouth. She hadn't dropped that cloth in weeks. Not since the day she'd stopped speaking. Sabbia remained motionless, his head now tilted slightly. It was almost imperceptible, a gesture of curiosity, of openness. Sesto mimicked it. Her tiny chin shifted to the side, perfectly mirroring him. Riccardo took half a step forward, but Alessia reached out, stopping him with a hand to his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "Let her lead." He stayed still, heart in his throat, every instinct screaming to kneel, to touch, to speak, but the silence had become sacred now. This was not his moment to own. It was hers. For the first time in months, Sesto was choosing to look, choosing to connect. And not with her father or her mother, but with him. Sabbia's tail did not wag. His ears did not perk. Instead, he lowered his body slowly, lying on his belly, keeping his face level with Sesto's. It was not an invitation, but a declaration. I'm not here to chase you. I'm here to wait. Sesto's body shifted forward, ever so slightly, like gravity was pulling her closer. No fear. No panic. Just stillness and awareness. Riccardo swallowed hard. The world outside their walls, the business, the threats, the alliances, disappeared entirely. This was not something that could be bought or bartered. It wasn't strategy or structure. It was something else, raw, ancient, and human. Alessia knelt beside him now, unable to stay back any longer. Her eyes shimmered, watching their daughter with the trembling hope of someone too afraid to believe in miracles. She sees him, she breathed. Really sees him. Riccardo nodded slowly, his voice dry as dust. It's the first time since she changed. No one had ever been able to explain it. The sudden withdrawal. The fading responses. She hadn't been born like this. One day she was laughing. The next, she vanished inside herself. Doctors said it was developmental. Others hinted at psychological stress. But deep inside, both parents knew something had gone quiet inside their child, and no one had been able to reach her. Until now. Sabbia slowly blinked once, then again, slow, deliberate movements. Sesto copied him. Then she giggled. Not loudly, not wildly, but giggled. The sound, small as it was, ricocheted through the room like a firecracker. Riccardo's knees nearly gave out. Alessia gasped again. Did you hear? Yes. Oh my God. She laughed. She hasn't. I know. They both turned back, as if afraid the sound might disappear if acknowledged too loudly. But Sesto hadn't stopped. Her mouth formed another sound, garbled, high-pitched, almost babbling, but unmistakably directed. Her eyes stayed glued to Sabbia. The dog answered with a soft, low whine barely audible. Her face lit up. She's talking to him, Alessia whispered, tears spilling freely now. Riccardo felt his knees beside her, breath ragged. She's never responded like this. Not even to you. I know. She hears him. The weight of those words struck him hard, like a punch to the ribs. It wasn't just a connection. It was recognition. A sound, a frequency, something in Sabbia's presence had reached her. Riccardo's entire mind reeled back to the night he'd read that article, the phrase that clung to him now like prophecy, when animals heal what words cannot. He had thought it a metaphor. But what if it wasn't? What if this dog, this quiet, steady creature, wasn't just calming her? What if Sabbia was speaking her language? And what if they her own parents never had? Alessia, Riccardo said softly. It's not just the dog. It's his voice. Alessia stared at him confused. The way he sounds. It's low, deep, almost vibrational. She blinked. You think she can't hear us? I think she hears him. They sat there, frozen by the possibility, afraid to believe it, but unable to deny what they had just seen. The red cloth still lay on Sesto's lap untouched. Sabbia shifted closer, just a few inches. Sesto leaned forward. Their noses nearly touched. Then, softly, Sesto whispered something, a sound neither parent could fully interpret, but it was hers. And it was new. Riccardo reached blindly for Alessia's hand, gripping it tightly. Whatever this is, he said hoarsely, it's real. Alessia nodded, choking on a quiet sob. I don't care what it means. I don't care what we have to do. She's back. Even if it's only a piece. For the next 10 minutes, the house remained still, no footsteps, no voices, only the quiet exchange between girl and dog. Riccardo didn't need answers yet. He didn't need labels or diagnoses. All he needed was this moment. His daughter, the one he feared might never return, had made contact. And all it took was a creature who said nothing, but listened with his whole being. In the days that followed, the house changed. Not loudly, not instantly, but in soft, almost invisible shifts, like dust being cleared from old furniture. Where silence had once ruled like a tyrant, there were now quiet hums of possibility. Sesto still didn't speak, not in any full sense, but she watched. She watched Sabbia like he held the keys to a door she wasn't ready to open yet, but maybe soon. She followed him from room to room, her red cloth forgotten on the arm of a velvet chair. If Sabbia lay down, she sat near him. If he turned his head, she mirrored him without hesitation. No one told her to do it. No one taught her how. Alessia watched it unfold with her hands clenched at her chest, afraid even a whisper might shatter the magic happening in front of them. Riccardo kept his distance at first, observing like a man watching glass tremble on the edge of a table, terrified to be the reason it fell. But every time he saw Sesto tilt her head or blink in perfect rhythm with Sabbia, something inside him cracked. It wasn't just mimicry. It was awareness. It was her mind stepping out from behind the curtain of silence and seeing someone waiting for her on the other side. Sabbia never demanded attention. He didn't beg for it, didn't push or whine or nudge. He simply existed, steady, grounded, and present. His eyes were always open when she was near, as if he knew the cost of being the first thing she ever truly noticed. Alessia began referring to him as the Sentinel, and the name stuck. He wasn't a pet. He was a bridge. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the windows, and the house was quiet, wrapped in that kind of peaceful lull that usually precedes naps or tears. Sesto sat on the carpet in the sunroom, legs crossed clumsily beneath her, hands resting on her lap. Sabbia was a few feet away, lying down but alert, his head tilted slightly to the right. Slowly, Sesto tilted hers in the same direction, then paused. Riccardo, standing near the doorway, froze. Alessia, seated on the couch with her knitting untouched in her lap, gasped. "She did it again," she whispered. Riccardo nodded but didn't answer. He could barely breathe. Then it happened. A small sound escaped Sesto's lips. Not a word. Not a cry. A sound soft, uncertain, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't even directed at anyone, but it was real. It was laughter, trapped in the throat of a ghost trying to remember how to live. Alessia clamped her hand over her mouth, eyes welling up with tears. Riccardo gripped the back of a nearby chair so hard his knuckles turned white. It wasn't the kind of laugh that echoed off walls. It was the kind that echoed through memory, a sound he hadn't heard since she was small enough to sleep on his chest. A sound they both thought they might never hear again. Alessia let out a sharp, trembling breath. She laughed, she said, as though saying it made it more real. "My God, Rick," she laughed. Riccardo nodded once, jaw clenched, unable to speak. He had been shot, stabbed, tortured. But nothing in his life had ever hit him as hard as that one fragile sound. It undid him completely. Sesto giggled again, this time louder, as if the first sound had unlocked something inside her. Her hands clapped together once, startled by the noise she'd made. She looked at Sabbia, who blinked once, slowly, and tilted his head again. She copied him instantly. Another soft laugh bubbled up. The dog remained still, but somehow, Riccardo swore he saw his eyes soften. Alessia broke. She slid off the couch, dropping to her knees beside Sesto. She didn't touch her, just watched, crying quietly, covering her mouth with both hands like she was trying to hold in a decade of grief. Riccardo turned away from them, his back to the room, both palms flat against the wall. His shoulders trembled, the silence pressing down on him like a confession. He didn't cry, not in the way others did. But his grip on the chair didn't loosen for nearly a full minute. His breath came in sharp, ragged pulls as if his body was trying to purge all the guilt, all the helplessness he'd buried. "Ghosts don't laugh," he muttered, his voice barely audible. But she just did. That night, after the house had quieted and the storm had passed, Riccardo slipped into Sesto's room. Alessia was asleep in their bed, emotionally spent. Sabbia lay curled at the foot of Sesto's crib, his fur rising and falling in slow rhythm. Riccardo knelt beside her, one knee on the hardwood, careful not to make a sound. The only light came from the hallway, casting a pale golden halo across her sleeping face. He stared at her in silence, afraid to wake her, afraid to lose the fragile thread that had been tied between them that day. "Are you coming back to us?" he whispered. The words weren't a demand. They weren't even a plea. They were a hope. A hope from a man who had never allowed himself the luxury of needing anything from anyone, not even his own child. She didn't move, didn't stir, but her lips parted slightly in her sleep, as if she were holding on to a laugh even in dreams. Riccardo reached through the crib slats and brushed her hair back gently. "We'll follow whatever path you take," he said, "even if it's one we don't understand." He looked down at Sabbia. The dog blinked once in acknowledgement. That was enough. The ghost of silence still lingered in their home, but now it had company. A sound. A stare. A laugh. Proof that Sesto wasn't lost. She was simply learning how to find her way back. Have you ever witnessed a moment so small, a look, a sound, a gesture, that changed everything? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes healing doesn't roar. It whispers. Riccardo Bruno had learned to notice things others missed: the twitch of a lie in a poker game, the hesitation in a double cross, the shift in breath before a betrayal. But now his skills were trained on something far more delicate. He spent hours simply watching, not from the shadows of a warehouse, but from the doorway of the sunroom. Each morning, Sesto and Sabbia resumed their strange dance, quiet, synchronized, deliberate. She trailed behind him like a ghost still tethered to earth, and somehow, he seemed to understand that he was her guide. When Sabbia moved, Sesto followed. When he sat, she stilled. But it wasn't until Riccardo noticed the sounds that everything began to click. Sabbia, though silent in bark, made low, humming whines, vibrations more than noises. And each time, Sesto reacted, her head tilting, her lips parting, her eyes sparking with recognition. Alessia didn't notice it at first. "She's getting better," she said with a tremble of hope in her voice. "The dog's just good for her." But Riccardo watched with a different kind of focus. One night, he clapped loudly behind Sesto while she stared at Sabbia. No reaction. He clapped again. Nothing. But the moment Sabbia gave a low groan while stretching, Sesto turned her head. Riccardo's heart skipped. "Alessia," he said cautiously. She didn't respond to the clap. Alessia frowned. Maybe she was distracted. "She wasn't," Riccardo replied. "She only moved when Sabbia made that noise." His mind whirled, pieces starting to align in a pattern he hadn't dared consider. That night, Riccardo descended to the music room, a space rarely used, once gifted by a composer whose life he'd saved in Naples. Dust covered the grand piano and cello cases, but the strings still held pitch. He lifted a cello bow with fingers that had once pulled triggers, not strings. He didn't know how to play, not properly. But he didn't need a song. He needed a tone. He positioned the cello between his knees, tightening the bow with careful precision. Sabbia wandered in silently, lying down near the door. Sesto sat cross-legged on the rug, her eyes already on him. Riccardo drew the bow across the lowest string, a long, deep note that vibrated through the floorboards. Sesto flinched, then blinked, then smiled. Riccardo's chest tightened as he did it again, slower this time. The note hummed like a whisper from the earth. Sesto giggled. It was the same giggle he had heard when Sabbia tilted his head days earlier. Riccardo dropped the bow onto the floor, stunned. It wasn't the melody, it was the frequency. Alessia appeared in the doorway, wide-eyed. "What happened?" Riccardo turned to her slowly, voice low. She heard it. She heard it, Alessia. Not the high keys. Not the sharp notes. Just that one sound. Alessia fell silent. The look on her face was not confusion. It was grief and relief crashing into each other all at once. Riccardo didn't sleep that night. He sat in the study, laptop open, searching for answers in the places only desperate men go. Forums. Research journals. Parental blogs buried under years of heartbreak and hope. The term appeared again and again: low-frequency hearing. Children who could hear bass tones but not human speech. Some could be helped. Others had to adapt. Most went undiagnosed for years. He made a call the next morning, a private clinic outside the city, one that operated under confidentiality and discretion. "I want a hearing assessment," he said. Under a false name. The receptionist paused. "Sir, we don't. This isn't a request," Riccardo interrupted. "I'm sending a driver. You'll be ready." 2 hours later, Sesto was seated in a soundproof room, Alessia beside her, headphones cupped over her ears. The specialist, a woman named Dr. Karen Holt, took Riccardo aside. "We'll start with tonal tests," she said. "From high to low. Watch her reactions." Riccardo nodded once, jaw tight. "I don't want theories. I want truth." The room was still. One by one, the tones played, chirps, clicks, sharp beeps. Sesto didn't move. Didn't blink. Alessia's hand trembled in her lap. Riccardo stood behind the glass, breath held, teeth clenched. Then Dr. Holt played a long, low note, deeper than the others, slow and vibrating. Sesto blinked. Then turned. Then pointed at the speaker. A second note played, even deeper. She laughed. Riccardo's knees buckled slightly. In the observation room, Dr. Holt was silent. Then she exhaled. "She has low-frequency hearing. It's extremely rare to be isolated like this. Most cases go undetected unless someone is specifically looking for it." She glanced at Riccardo. "You were looking." "Why?" Riccardo didn't answer at first. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "Because my dog made her laugh." Back at the estate that evening, Riccardo watched Sesto toddle after Sabbia through the garden. She was humming now, not songs, not words, just noise. But it was deliberate. And she smiled when she made it. He sat on the back steps, elbows on his knees, the sun setting behind him. Sabbia circled around and dropped beside him, tail thudding softly against the ground. Riccardo reached out, running a hand through the dog's thick coat. "You didn't just get through to her," he whispered. "You heard her. When none of us did." He looked out across the yard, eyes wet, voice steady. "And for that, you'll always have a place in this family." In the criminal underworld, silence could mean one of two things: strength or surrender. When Riccardo Bruno stopped showing up at meetings, answering calls, or enforcing his presence in the city's darker corners, whispers started circulating fast. First among his allies, then among his enemies. "He's gone soft," one lieutenant muttered behind closed doors. "He's slipping," said another, watching the doors of Casa Bruno remain shut like a mausoleum of forgotten power. The Vitali family, longtime rivals with just enough tact to avoid open war, took Riccardo's retreat as a signal. They began making subtle moves, shaking down old contacts, squeezing Bruno's suppliers, inching their way into neutral zones. They thought the lion had grown tired. They didn't know he was watching from behind his marble walls, not retreating, but redirecting. Riccardo Bruno wasn't guarding territory anymore. He was learning to guard something far more fragile. Inside Casa Bruno, the echo of violence had faded. The same marble floors once stained with footsteps of enforcers were now a stage for barefoot mornings. Riccardo had changed, not overnight, not loudly, but profoundly. He began spending his evenings in the sunroom, reading picture books aloud in the lowest register of his voice. Not because he enjoyed the stories, but because his daughter could hear him that way. Each word was chosen with care, drawn out like a slow song. Sesto sat cross-legged on the floor, her red silk cloth now resting at her side rather than clutched in her fist. Her eyes, once hollow, followed his lips with a focus that broke him inside. When he paused, she leaned in, not impatiently, but eagerly. It was as if she was telling him, "Don't stop. I'm here. I'm listening." Alessia noticed the shift first. "Your voice," she said one evening, handing him a cup of tea, "it's different." Riccardo blinked at her. "Lower," she added. "Deeper. Like you're meeting her halfway." He didn't respond, but he didn't have to. His silence no longer meant distance. It meant devotion. And while Riccardo read and hummed bass notes that lingered in the hallways like incense, Alessia took on a new role. She started walking Sabbia each morning, not with the caution of a woman handling a dog, but the respect of someone escorting a guardian. She brushed his fur, learned his habits, spoke to him as if he understood every word. And somehow he did. "He's not just a dog," she told Riccardo one day, voice firm. "He's her translator." Sabbia had become more than a companion. He was a bridge, the unspoken guide between a little girl's locked world and her parents' aching hearts. When Riccardo stood at the window, watching Alessia walk with Sesto and Sabbia around the garden, he felt something foreign to him. Not pride, not control, peace. But the outside world was not as easily softened. The Vitali family's latest move came with a message. One of Bruno's men was found roughed up outside a club near the harbor, with a note pinned to his chest, "You sleep, we build." Riccardo read it in silence. He didn't react, didn't send men, didn't make calls. Instead, he folded the paper neatly and slid it into a drawer, then turned back to the crib where Sesto napped, her breath soft and steady. The old Riccardo would have retaliated by sunrise. The man who now knelt beside his daughter chose something far more dangerous: patience. He didn't forget, though. No one would mistake his stillness for surrender if they truly knew him. The moment Sesto laughed again, it would signal the day he could return, not because he wanted to, but because he finally could. Until then, he'd stay in the marble halls of his own making, listening for the sounds only she could give him. His empire could wait. One night, long after the staff had retired and the estate had gone quiet, Riccardo sat on the floor beside Sesto's crib. Sabbia lay nearby, his slow breaths in rhythm with the ticking grandfather clock in the corridor. Riccardo leaned close, whispering gently, a soft hum, followed by her name in a tone so low it felt like a vibration in the air. "Piccolina," he murmured. "Can you hear me tonight?" Sesto stirred. Her lips moved. A sound escaped, a tiny babble half-formed, but full of intent. Riccardo's breath caught. He leaned in closer, repeating the sound back to her slower. She giggled and whispered it again. Her smile, small, sleepy, radiant, broke him. He'd faced executions, betrayals, federal raids. But this half-laugh, half-word, was the most dangerous thing he'd ever encountered. Because it made him hope. He pressed his forehead gently against the crib railing and whispered, "Ti sento, amore." "I hear you now." Behind him, Alessia stood in the shadows, one hand clutching the doorframe. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched her husband, the man once feared across continents, now kneeling like a penitent in his daughter's room. She wiped away a tear and turned to leave, letting them have their moment. In the distance, another message from the Vitalis waited to be delivered. But Riccardo didn't rise. Not yet. Because the only war he cared about now was the one he was winning, inch by inch, inside the four walls of his home. Not through threats or fear, but through frequency. Through tone. Through love he never knew he could carry. The call came just after dawn, interrupting the quiet rhythm of a home that had only recently begun to breathe again. Luca's voice was tense, clipped, not with fear, but urgency. "Vitali's moving," he said. "Family heads are gathering. They're testing the waters, Rick. If you're not there, they'll write your name in the past tense." Riccardo stood at the kitchen counter, fingers wrapped around a warm cup of black coffee. Sabbia lay by the doorway, watching him without blinking. In the next room, Sesto giggled faintly at a low musical toy, her laughter barely rising above a whisper, but enough to crack his focus in two. He didn't want to leave. Not now. Not when every day brought her a little further into the world. But some things could not be ignored, no matter how transformed he had become. He nodded once and said, "Arrange the room." No threats. No entourage. Just me. Luca paused. "You sure?" Riccardo's voice dropped, firm but measured. "They'll hear me. That's all that matters." 2 hours later, the cold breath of an abandoned warehouse welcomed Riccardo like an old friend. Steel walls. Cement dust. The stench of gasoline and betrayal. He stood at the center of the cracked concrete floor while men in long coats circled like wolves. Vitali's men, sharp-eyed, twitchy, hungry. Guns were already visible, tucked under coats, holstered but itching. Riccardo didn't flinch. He removed his gloves slowly and tucked them into his coat pocket, his movements deliberate. "Put them down," he said calmly. His voice low, resonant, commanding without force. rippled across the space like a slow tide. No one moved. Not at first. But the tone, not loud, not aggressive, carried a weight they hadn't expected. The same tone he used to read fairy tales to his daughter now silenced a room full of killers. Luca stepped forward, arms slightly raised. No need for this. We talk. We listen. One by one, the tension broke, like frost cracking beneath steady sun. Weapons lowered. Breathing eased. Vitali himself stepped out from the back shadows, silver-haired, smug. You disappeared, Bruno. We assumed you were finished. Riccardo met his gaze, unwavering. I had something more important to protect. A few of the men chuckled until they realized he wasn't joking. His calm wasn't weakness. It was controlled fire. You want war. Riccardo continued, his tone dark but even. You'll get it. But not here. And not now. Because the next time you move against me, it won't be guns that silence your men. It'll be the sound of everything you love, slipping away, piece by piece. Vitali narrowed his eyes. But he didn't respond. He didn't need to. The room had already chosen its silence. By the time Riccardo returned to Casa Bruno, the sun had dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the estate. The garden lights flickered on like small, loyal sentries. He stepped out of the car slowly, bones aching in a way they hadn't for years. But it wasn't from the confrontation, it was from the distance. Every second away from her now felt like a gamble. He entered through the side doors, brushing the cold from his shoulders. He didn't expect what came next. From down the hall, just outside the sunroom, he heard it. A small voice. Soft. Fragile. Trying to be heard. Ba. He froze. Babie. His heart nearly stopped. He stepped forward, one hand gripping the wall as if the house itself might tilt beneath him. Alessia was kneeling on the floor, tears streaking her cheeks, arms outstretched toward their daughter. And Sesto, their quiet, watching, gentle Sesto, was standing. Standing on her own. Taking careful, tiny steps. Toward Sabbia. Toward her family. Toward sound. She wobbled slightly, arms extended like wings. Her voice cracked the air again, stronger this time. Babie. Riccardo stumbled into the room, breathless, stunned. Alessia looked up at him, trembling. She called you, she whispered. She called you. He knelt, too fast, his knees slamming against the floor, arms open. Sesto didn't run, but she moved 1, 2, 3 steps, then collapsed into his chest. His arms wrapped around her, tight and desperate, his face buried in her hair. He didn't cry. Not loudly. But the tears came anyway, slipping quietly down his cheeks. You hear me, Piccolina? He whispered against her temple. Then I'll never stop speaking your language. Behind him, Sabbia lay down, resting his head against Riccardo's knee as if to say, she found you. Now don't lose her again. That night, the halls of Casa Bruno echoed not with gunfire or threats, but with the first true words spoken between father and daughter. It wasn't much, not to the world. But to Riccardo, it was everything. A declaration. A surrender. A promise. Have you ever been called by someone in a way that changed everything, not just with a name, but with meaning? Share your story in the comments. Your words might just echo into someone else's breakthrough. It started with a sketch on the back of a napkin, a crude layout of an unused east wing of the estate. Once reserved for storage and wine tasting, Riccardo had barely set foot there in years. But now, every inch of it was reimagined in his mind. Padded floors, layered acoustics, adjustable frequencies. It wouldn't be a playroom. It would be a sanctuary for sound, for stillness, for Sesto. Construction began quietly. Riccardo didn't bring in designers or architects. He brought in engineers, acoustic consultants, therapists who specialized in resonance therapy and low-frequency immersion. Most of them never knew whose house they were working in. They were paid in cash, bound by silence, and escorted in and out by a trusted few. The transformation was slow, meticulous, and deeply personal. Alessia walked the hall with him one morning, hands brushing the new sound-absorbing panels. It's like a cathedral, she whispered. Not for prayer, Riccardo replied. For reception. The phrase hung in the air. It wasn't about teaching Sesto to speak. It was about helping her receive the world on her terms. In the center of the new wing, a room was built with no sharp corners. Rounded walls. Wood-paneled ceilings. The space had no furniture, only cushioned floors and layered rugs that gave underfoot like earth after rain. In one corner, a cello leaned against the wall. In another, a set of tuned drums low, tribal, patient. And in the center, a large velvet floor cushion where Sabbia now spent most of his days. He had been given more than a place, he had been given status. He wasn't just tolerated. He was honored. A brass plate near the new wing's entrance read, "In gratitude to Sabbia, the one who listened first." Alessia insisted on it. Riccardo hadn't argued. It was the least they could do. Sesto began exploring the new rooms without hesitation. She no longer clung to walls or stared only at movement. Now she tracked tones. She'd crawl toward the soft pulse of a drum or sway slightly when the cello echoed through the floor. Her laughter, though still rare, came more easily. And when she made sounds of her own, they weren't random, they were deliberate. Echoes of what she'd heard. Riccardo started each morning the same way, low hums into the belly of a drum, fingers sliding across cello strings, slow vocal tones practiced like prayers. Not for show. Not for music. For connection. Sesto responded with nods, smiles, and small sounds that mimicked pitch more than language. It was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Riccardo brought in a small upright piano tuned entirely to low registers. He played carefully, not with the grace of a musician, but the commitment of a father building bridges. Sesto leaned against Sabbia, eyes closed, fingers tapping the rhythm against his back. "She hears the world differently," Alessia whispered behind him. "And now, so do we." Riccardo didn't stop at the therapy room. In private, he began writing letters. Dozens of them. To research centers, children's hospitals, therapists, and clinics. Not with his name. Not with his power. Just an anonymous donor. Quiet gifts for those trying to understand the same thing he had nearly missed frequency. One letter read, "For the child who does not respond, consider tone. Not volume. Not repetition. Tone. You might not be unheard. You might simply be unread." Another contained a check large enough to fund an entire pediatric wing. Accompanying it was a single sentence. "Some children don't hear like we speak. Try speaking like they hear." None of the recipients knew the truth, that these letters came from a man once feared across continents. A man who once ended lives without hesitation now devoted his nights to helping begin them. Sabbia remained by his side through it all, often curled beneath the desk while Riccardo scribbled long into the dark hours. Whenever he paused, unsure of his words, the dog would glance up as if to say, "Keep going. She's worth it." In time, word of Riccardo's reclusion faded. The Vitali family made no further moves. Whatever they had hoped to exploit had vanished, swallowed by a man who no longer ruled by fear, but by purpose. His empire still stood, untouched, guarded by loyalists. But its king now ruled from a quieter throne, one made of rugs and cello strings, giggles, and unspoken miracles. One afternoon, Riccardo entered the therapy room to find Sesto sitting on Sabbia's back, giggling as she tapped a small drum between her knees. She turned when she heard his hum, not loudly, but immediately. Her face broke into a grin, and she echoed him, a low, soft tone from the back of her throat. It wasn't a word, but it was a dialogue. Riccardo knelt beside her, pressing a hand to her back, letting her feel the rhythm of his voice through his chest. "This is your room," he said. "A place where silence is not a prison. It's a canvas." She didn't understand the words, not yet, but she smiled anyway. That was enough. The night was warm, the kind that settled over the world like a soft promise rather than a threat. Fairy lights draped across the backyard of Casa Bruno, flickering gently beneath olive trees, their glow diffused through soft mist and quiet air. A light breeze stirred the hanging vines, and on the grass below, Sesto giggled, a bright, airy sound that once would have shattered Riccardo's soul, but now soothed it. She chased Sabbia across the garden path, her bare feet padding softly over stone and earth, her arms flailing like wings too excited to fold. The cream-colored dog trotted just ahead, tail high, ears alert, always watching, always waiting, never straying too far. Riccardo watched them from the balcony, a hand resting lightly on the rail, his espresso cooling, untouched beside him. His eyes didn't scan for threats anymore. Not tonight. His mind didn't wander to the docks or the shadows between city streets. The fire that once forged his name had cooled, tempered into something quieter, still hot, still present, but no longer burning for conquest. He hadn't given up power, he had simply changed its shape. What he once ruled with fear, he now ruled with attention. Instead of orders, he gave presence. Instead of commands, he gave time. It was slower, yes, but it was deeper. It had been a full year since Sesto spoke her first word, and every day since had been another small miracle. She now laughed easily, especially when Sabbia did his signature slow head tilt. She hummed more than she spoke, but Riccardo had learned to understand her, the tone of her babble, the rhythm of her claps, the pitch of her excitement. Alessia said it best one night, watching them sit side by side on the therapy room floor. She doesn't need a language yet. She already has one. The therapy suite had grown into something more. Schools had reached out, research centers too, but Riccardo declined them all. He didn't need fame for what they discovered. He only needed her. So he poured quiet money into anonymous foundations, making sure other children like Sesto were never dismissed again. Luca, ever loyal, continued to manage the outer walls of the empire. But even he had changed. Funny, he said once while sipping a bitter coffee, "You went soft," and somehow everyone backed off. Riccardo had simply replied, "Only the loudest men mistake silence for surrender." He had received letters. Rivals inquiring, allies growing restless, politicians curious. But he answered only one. It came from Matteo Vitali, once a wolf, now a businessman looking to secure a future that didn't smell of blood. Riccardo didn't meet him in a warehouse or on neutral turf. He sent a reply with a simple line, "Come to the garden. Leave your guard behind." Matteo arrived just before sunset, escorted only by a driver who stayed parked along the outer wall. The rival boss stepped onto the terrace, cautiously at first, taking in the peace he hadn't expected. Riccardo greeted him not with a handshake, but a nod. No theatrics. No performance. Just presence. "I heard your daughter's voice," Matteo said. "I hear it every day," Riccardo replied. "She's doing well?" "She's doing real. That's enough." They didn't talk about territory. They didn't talk about power. For the first time in their long, shadowed history, they talked like men who had seen the inside of a fire and emerged on the other side scarred, wiser, and no longer interested in adding kindling. From the garden, a high-pitched giggle cut through the air, full and round. Matteo looked up in surprise. "Is that?" Riccardo didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for him to follow. They stepped into the backyard, the soft glow of fairy lights painting the grass in silver threads. Sesto was lying on her back now, Sabbia beside her, both staring up at the stars as if decoding constellations. She sat up at the sound of footsteps, her eyes wide and bright. "Babie," she called, waving. Riccardo knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Ciao, Piccolina," he murmured, his voice deep, even, grounding. She clapped twice, and Sabbia responded with a soft huff, resting his head on her lap. Matteo watched silently, the weight of history folding neatly behind them like a forgotten page. There, in the muted backyard of a once feared man's estate, no deals were signed, no threats exchanged. Only peace offered, not through dominance, but through demonstration. Through the presence of a child reborn, a dog who never left her side, and a man who had learned the hardest lesson of all, how to listen. As the final light dipped beyond the hedge line and night settled in like a lullaby, Riccardo stood with his daughter in his arms. She tucked her face into his shoulder, still humming something without form but full of meaning. Sabbia circled their feet and lay down, his watch never truly ending. Matteo turned to leave, nodding once, not in surrender, but in understanding. Riccardo looked out across his garden, then up toward the house he once filled with silence and shadows. Tonight, it held only warmth. Only light. She didn't need a boss. She needed a father. And a dog who knew how to listen. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.